Hey, I'm Amanda from Trifecta Fitness. We're proud to be Clarksville's new Get Fit headquarters. Trifecta Fitness is a state-of-the-art spin and strength training studio. Our spin studio is truly one of a kind in this area, complete with 20 state-of-the-art live fitness bikes and an incredible sound system. Our strength training is done in small groups of 6 or fewer, and all of our strength and spin classes are scalable for every level of experience. Come see us in the heart of Clarksville, just behind MAPCO at the corner of Old Trenton Road and Wilma Rudolph Boulevard. Call us for more info at 931-542-6265 or download our Trifecta Fitness app for a full list of upcoming classes.
For every veteran, there is a story about a calling to serve, to fight for the freedoms of the American people. And every story has a struggle, a sacrifice, and invisible wounds. Warrior Watts programs help veterans recover from PTSD and invisible wounds through exercise, nutrition, and connecting with other veteran leaders. It is estimated that 22 veterans die each day by suicide, and another 30 veterans die each day by substance abuse. These are preventable deaths. Warrior Watt is committed to fighting PTSD through fitness, nutrition, and community. Got the privilege and opportunity to support our heroes in their time of need. Will you join us and take action?
All right. Welcome back. MisFitNation. We are a show founded by a veteran and hosted by 2 veterans and a military spouse. Our mission is to get people to tell their story to the world. If you're an author, share your tips with Misfit Nation. If you're a musician or actor, our audience needs to know how they too can get into the business. Coaches, we love our coaches. Come on and share some of your tips with the Misfit Nation to help them become better versions of themselves. If you're a corporate leader or an entrepreneur, come on and share how you did it and how hard you have fought for success. If you're a veteran, first responder, or Gold Star family, we would love to have you come on and just share your story with the Misfit Nation. We always have time for you. If you're feeling down, alone, or starting to see the darkness, stop. Think about those who are around you. You are not alone. You will be missed. If you feel like your problems will be a burden to those in your inner circle or are embarrassed, dial 988. If you are a veteran, take option 1. We need you to keep pushing forward. Don't make a permanent solution to a temporary problem. If you're a new listener, welcome to the Misfit Nation. Be sure to subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast apps and also on our YouTube channel at @_Misfit Nation. Subscribe and click the bell to keep you up to date with our latest episodes and all of our news. You can also find us on Heroes Media Group and About Face Radio. Now, let's get to the show. All right. Welcome to our Thursday after dinner show. It's great to have you here tonight. Thank you, Adam Baum, for passing the mic over to us. And you have a safe and enjoyable night before your show tomorrow night. The great music you play tomorrow night on About Face Radio. Tonight, y'all, we have an award-winning journalist, writer, editor, and foreign policy and national security analyst with more than 20 years of experience in media and government. He is currently the managing editor of National Defense Magazine and author of Passport Stamps, Searching the World for a War to Call Home, a memoir of his journey to become NPR's last Kabul-based correspondent and the mental health impacts of covering conflict and tragedy. So without further ado, let's welcome Sean Carberry, professional author, journalist, and foreign affairs writer. Hey, Sean, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
It's awesome to connect, and we were in country a couple times, probably at the same time, just in different parts of Afghanistan.
Yep.
Probably crossed paths in Iraq as well. I was there early on in Iraq War, 2003, 2004. So it was in the pup stage of the war, I guess, at that point. But you got to see a lot of things from a different angle than I did. So you were able to actually take a breath and say, "Hey, this is what I'm seeing," and now you were able to write your memoir, which is amazing.
Well, thanks. Yeah. And I did miss you by a bit in Iraq. I got there in 2008, and it was very different then than what you experienced. But yeah, it's I think important for all of us to continue talking about it all.
Definitely, and I think as part of what your memoir show is the mental health impacts of just for you guys covering it. A lot of people don't think about that. Our journalists go over there. People think, oh, they're just bloodthirsty. They're doing this for money, but you guys have to see everything that we see, but not be actually protected and not have to actually be behind a gun, either behind a lens or a microphone, and trying to cover it and not get killed as well.
Yeah, it's a vantage point, and something that certainly when I got into it didn't really fully appreciate all the aspects of it. I think like a lot of people, I ended up getting into that kind of work because of 9/11. I was early in my journalism career at that time, and I was working as a producer for an NPR program in Boston. So I was, in a studio very far removed from everything. But that fall of 2001, when we would be calling out, I'd be calling satellite phones in Afghanistan to get journalists there on the program to give us a debrief at the top of the show, what was going on, what had happened that day. And I felt sitting in that control room that I needed to do more to report on the story of, really our generation. It was, as a journalist, as an American, it was, the biggest event in our lifetime. And that drove me to want to get out there and see it and tell the story. And, eventually got there. It wasn't until 2007 that I really started getting out into some of those places. But I was not really prepared for some of the aspects and the realization that, okay, I'm out here reporting on a lot of horrible things, seeing a lot of horrible things, hearing a lot of horrible things, and certainly had no mental health sort of training or preparation ahead of time. It was something that again, maybe others really thought about it beforehand, but I'm not sure a lot of us did. I think you're thinking about doing the job. You're there, you have a mission, a purpose. You're there to observe, tell a story. And you're not really thinking about, well, how is this going to impact me or change me over time as I'm doing this work? So that was certainly, kind of a surprise to me over the years that I spent in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Congo, down the list. And, again, took some time to realize that, civilians do experience things as well. And there just hasn't been a lot of conversation about it. As well as anyone, the challenges that veterans face and the difficulties of still trying to get awareness and care and resources into that community that, most people see and understand the toll on veterans that the last 20 years have taken. But certainly, you look at how many civilians, how many diplomats, how many humanitarian workers, how many journalists, even how many contractors have, spent time downrange in these places. And some had some incredibly traumatic experiences. And there's really, there's nothing when you come back. There's no VA for civilians who work in these places. So, that was sort of a big realization for me and a big part of, my experiences, and then ultimately writing the book and trying to get to a place of raising awareness and trying to build bridges also between the veteran and military and civilian communities, and help try to support each other.
Definitely. And you alluded to it there, that a lot of people don't realize the divide, what you guys go through, or any civilian that's on the battlefield. in my opening, you see about the 22 a day of the veterans that are 22 that are reported a day. It's probably close to 44 to 50. But you don't see the numbers of a journalist or the numbers of diplomats or numbers of even U.S. aid personnel who were over there who actually are doing the same things. You don't see those numbers because it's not a number people want to say, or it's not reported that, oh, he was a journalist or she was a journalist and they killed themselves. You're not going to hear that at all. It's not something that's broadcast.
Well, and fortunately, at least it doesn't seem like it's happening in significant numbers. So that's the good news piece of it is that I'm not aware of large numbers of it. I know a lot of people that are struggling with it, who are struggling with self-medication or just living with some type of chronic PTSD or things like that. And a lot of people in that community, what they do is they don't leave that community, right? I mean, you stay immersed in it so that you never sort of experience that withdrawal and that period of processing and trying to readjust to normal life isn't the right term because there is not much of a normal, but I mean, coming back to, like, for me, moving from Afghanistan back to Washington D.C. was way more of a shock than I was prepared for. But yeah, to your point, I mean, I think that's why it's been a challenge to raise awareness for the civilians. Because there aren't those statistics, it isn't as visible. It hasn't reached sort of a crisis level that people have no choice but to pay attention to it. But I look at it as more of a simmering problem, and that there are a lot of people out there that are dealing with things, are struggling to process a lot of things that they saw and heard and experienced, and like I say, the civilian world, it's just tough to get attention to it, and it's up to individual organizations to do things about it. News organizations, State Department, what have you, and I just don't think we've reached a tipping point of awareness and effort around it yet.
Definitely, and while you were there 12 to 14, and Sergeant Major Griffin was killed in a suicide bombing attack as they did a patrol. Flo Griffin got the Medal of Honor for this incident, but there was 3 military and 1 civilian who were killed in that incident. The 3 military got a lot of news, and the U.S. aid worker, diplomat, did not get a lot of news, but he was also killed doing a job that was much needed in that area. So that's another angle of the two that we don't see a lot of that, because it's more of we want to see what numbers of soldiers died, or not to see, or civilians on the battlefield, not any of you guys.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, certainly there are a lot of people that were under the broad term of contractor who were killed and injured over there. And look, as a journalist, I reported on military casualties, killed and wounded when I was over there, and we didn't even often get the information sometimes about contractors. When we would get the information from, NATO or the U.S. command there, they would only report sometimes the military. So, and then of course the other part, the Afghan civilians who were working with U.S. forces, we generally didn't hear about them. There was one pretty high profile incident in 2013 when I was there. There was a young foreign service officer who was working at the embassy in Kabul, and she was on it was a mission. I'm trying to remember which, it might've been Uruzgan. I'm trying to remember. It was down, towards southeast. And she was with, I think, a provincial reconstruction team or Army Civil Affairs, and they were on a humanitarian mission, I think, delivering some books to a school or something like that. And basically, there was a car bomb attack, and she was killed. And that was, that was incredibly rare, fortunately, in Afghanistan. I mean, there were very few State Department personnel killed, but that was one of those moments that did kind of put it on the radar screen that, hey, there are a lot of people out there that are risking their lives for this mission. And that, that also had a, pretty big effect on the civilian community there, really reflecting on, okay, what is the mission? What's going on here? Was that a necessary operation that they were on? And, raised a lot of difficult questions. And again, that was one that, she was a very committed public servant, very bright young person, great future ahead of her, and really believed in what she was doing. And unfortunately, paid the ultimate price.
Exactly. And like you said, we hardly ever heard of it. And even the day I was wounded, it was a contractor wounded not 50 meters from me. He got strapped on his neck. My medic actually helped him. But you never seen that stat. You've seen just me or the other soldiers that were hit that day. So those are the numbers that would get sent up. So I'm sure all the things you've seen in the nearly 2 decades of covering as a war correspondent, when did you start to notice some changes in your mind that maybe I need to start writing things down to maybe get this stuff out and maybe talk about it?
Yeah, it was something that I was sort of observing the impacts as I was going. It really, after, it's probably in my second time, so I spent about 5 years based in DC, and I would do short trips into places. So I'd do an embed for, a few weeks or something like that, and then come back. And so in 2009, it was October 2009, I was doing an embed in Host Province and Paktia. And there wasn't any, hardcore action that went on, but pretty much every base where I was during that embed, there was incoming at some point. And so, there was a boom and a run to the bunkers. And that was, I remember on that trip, that started to kind of pierce the bubble, because there was I think a phenomenon a lot of journalists had in embeds, that you felt kind of protected and safe and in a bubble. You're surrounded by the best forces in the world, and there is this kind of sense that they're going to protect you, and you're riding around in this giant MRAP and things like that. So I think it was easy sometimes to get a little complacent. And that embed, there was one time I was at Salerno in Host, and I was sitting at the Afghan-run bazaar on the base. And so there were a couple of U.S. soldiers, and I were sipping tea with some of the Afghans. Just all of a sudden, there was a whistling sound and a boom, and we looked over, and it was about 50, 75 yards away. And so after we ran to the bunkers and came out and looked at what happened, an incoming rocket hit a tree and detonated above a tent that had 7 soldiers sitting inside of it. And so it sprayed shrapnel all over the tent. And I actually write about that in my book. I sort of describe it as that scene in Pulp Fiction, when the kid comes running out of the bathroom and unloads his pistol at Jules and Vince, and doesn't hit him, right? And you see the bullet holes in the wall behind him, and they just kind of look, and it's like, how did we not get hit? That was kind of what happened in that tent. There was shrapnel damage all over the tent. Computer monitors were shattered, lights were shattered. You could see, holes in the floor. One of the 7 people in there got a small piece of shrapnel in the leg and walked off to get it treated. But if that tree hadn't been there, in all likelihood, the rocket would have landed in or near the tent and done catastrophic damage. And so that moment really kind of galvanized to me just the nature of it, the sort of game of inches, the luck that happens, and that any moment, if you're in theater, doesn't matter if you're on a big base or out on a patrol, there is the potential for something to happen at any time. And so your mindset is geared that way at that point. And so you realize, your idol is dialed up. You're always thinking about, the potential. And so when I came home from that embed, I definitely spent a little more time kind of processing that. And, each time I went down range and then eventually moved there, I realized that, I was in that high threat mindset. And then, the other side of that was I was constantly reporting on horrible things. And sometimes going to villages and hospitals and seeing, the after effects, interviewing people who had their lives devastated by an attack or something of that nature. And you're reporting that, you're doing a job, you're communicating it back to the public, informing people and hoping that leads to positive change. But you still have to put that somewhere. And that was, I could feel myself changing. I could feel myself being different around people when I came home, and finding it harder to talk to friends and family and people who couldn't relate to that. And it's, the same thing you hear in the veterans community, right? It's just, people come home and they'll talk to their battle buddies, but anyone who wasn't there, didn't see it, didn't experience it, you don't open up about that. You keep yourself isolated. And, the story I mentioned in the book, how it made me understand my grandfather. He served in the Navy in World War II, and he was on a munitions ship in the Pacific. And so growing up, I always wanted him to tell stories about being in the Navy in World War II. And he wouldn't. He had a couple of sort of fake joke stories that he would tell to kind of, distract you, basically. Like the one I always remember is he talked about how on the ship every morning he'd wake up and he'd take his socks and he'd throw them up to the ceiling. And if they stuck to the ceiling, he'd change them and put on a new pair. If they didn't, he'd wear the same pair again. Yeah. And so he had stories like that he'd tell to kind of diffuse the thing and distract you from wanting to ask deeper, tougher questions. And, my whole life, I was lucky he lived into my 40s, but never had a conversation with him in any depth about what he experienced in World War II. And as I started to notice myself changing from spending more time downrange and around these kinds of situations, I started to understand him and understand his headspace and how, you don't want to share a lot of this stuff with people. And, people are well-intentioned when they'll say, oh, wow, you were just in Afghanistan. What was it like? Was it dangerous? Were you scared? And, again, people mean well with these questions, but I don't think they're ever really prepared for what the real answer would be if you were to tell them that. So again, you kind of give them like, well, people like, what was it like in Kabul? I'll say it was dusty. Something kind of lighthearted to give an answer, and then hopefully not get a follow-up question. And so that, this thing when I really started after I got back, so the end of 2014, I got back and I just had a lot of time to process stuff. And, it took me years to really understand how everything affected me, just where I was in terms of headspace and how I related to other people and how I related to the world. And, ended up getting into, I did all the typical bad life choices, gambling, got into a relationship with the wrong person, all that stuff. Meanwhile, still I'm showing up to work. I look on the surface functional, professional. For a while I worked for the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. So I had, a high level, important government job and seemed like I was showing up every day, but when I wasn't in the office, my head was not in good places. And, got to a point where it was getting really dark. And so finally the decision was, okay, I write this book, because this is my way to claw back out and to process things, and then ultimately to start this conversation and to say, hey, there are other people out there that are affected by this, and the organizations that are sending journalists, aid workers, diplomats overseas aren't focusing on this, and they're not aware, they're not preparing people for what they're going to encounter. They're certainly not teaching people healthy coping skills. I mean, the self-medication that went on during my time in Kabul. People have heard all the stories about crazy parties and things like that. It was absolutely true. And the drugstores in Kabul sold Valium and Xanax and Ativan over the counter. So we did what we needed to do to get through the day and to go to sleep after a long day of covering some horrible piece of news. But that's no way to function long term.
Definitely. And I think everything you just described is what most veterans also go through, that same cycle. They come home, if they don't have someone that's stable in their lives, they make that wrong choice. The wrong choice is in relationships. They find a vice or vices, and then they keep trying to chase that high that they had over there, but it'll never come back. You can't get that high. It's like how they describe a heroin addict. Once you get that first hit, you can never find it. You're always chasing it after. The adrenaline rush from combat is a lot harder to get to receive doing anything else that's safe or not as hostile, I guess. So they can continuously chasing that. And I think it's the same thing. You went through that same roller coaster, and you're still on the roller coaster now, just that you're doing a lot better with it.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I don't think, I don't think you ever really get off it once you've gotten on it. You just, you learn how to ride it better. It's a continuing work. I mean, the arc of my book, it's sort of, it's a memoir. So it starts my initial getting into doing overseas reporting and getting in over my head. And I write very candidly about being, a bit of an idiot at times, and not really appreciating some of the danger, not really appreciating some of the local customs and nuances and things like that I had to deal with. And grew over time, became wiser and more respectful of the job, of the people that I was dealing with. And then the coming back and sort of the long, slow unraveling. And then I make there's no Hollywood ending yet. There's no perfect, everything's fine, life's great kind of thing. It's okay. Got through the worst of it. Sharing the story, which is the next step of trying to get it out there, empower other people to, raise their hand and say, hey, you know what? I actually experienced a lot of that too. And I could actually use someone to talk to or some help. So, it's one of those things. You got to get the story out there and start making it a normal thing for people to talk about it. The usual things, take away the stigma, right? That's, one of the big things is it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to say that you're not having a good day. So that's where sort of things are now, is really, trying to raise that awareness, have that conversation, and then look at what's out there in terms of current resources and what can we potentially do to put more resources at this and build more awareness. One of the things I'm doing, 'cause obviously as a journalist, my book is journalism focused. I mean, it's telling the story of my journalism experiences downrange. So I'm speaking to journalism students and journalism schools, and again, trying to raise awareness on the front end for people, saying, hey, if you're going to go down this road, this is an important thing, and we need people willing to go to these places and cover these stories. But here's some of what you're going to be in for. Here are mistakes that I made and other people I know made, and here's the wisdom I can impart, but we still need to have more of a conversation about what can we do to empower people, and give them, a little bit more mental safety. As a journalist, I went through the hostile environment training courses, which of course are all about how to try to recognize potential physical threats, see that you're about to walk into a minefield, or if you're in a minefield, how do you get out of it? How do you identify hostile checkpoints? How do you talk your way through a checkpoint? Things like that. And then obviously the traumatic first aid, if something does go wrong, But in those courses, there was never any discussion about the psychological or emotional aspects of it. And I didn't think about it at the time, but now I realize, that stuff needs to be part of it. Because it's like, okay, here's how you get through an incident. And then on the back end, here are some of the things that you need to do to come down from that and process that and realize that, it's sticking with you. I actually, it was interesting. I was just having a text conversation with a friend of mine who was in Kabul with me in 2014. And we were together on the night of January 17th when there was an attack on a Lebanese restaurant in Kabul, where a lot of the international community used to hang out. And I had dinner there the week before. And that night, the Taliban attacked the restaurant, killed 21 people, including a number of UN people, American University in Afghanistan people. I mean, there were, Western civilians that were friends of ours that were killed in that. And my friend and I today, we were just talking about how we can both still hear the gunfire from that night, because we were actually a couple blocks away when the attack happened. And we heard the gunfire, and it wasn't until later that we realized what was happening at the sound of that gunfire. And 9 years later, that sound is still as vivid in my mind as it was the day it happened.
I'm sure the sounds of that, smells that you had from any battles that you were in near, or even being by villages, seeing what the people were living like and smelling what they lived in, that kind of sticks with you too. And that also hurts the mindset a little bit as well. While you're there, you compartmentalize it. Like you said, you kind of unpacked it when you got home. Unknowingly you unpacked it, and then now you've packed it into the book of passports. And I think that's a great way to do it. One of the listeners said he still does the sock trick. He still uses it. He's a former EOD guy, and that doesn't surprise me. And my brother, he said he figured it'd be a good way to see if underwear needed changed. So they find humor in your granddad's story as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, he knew what he was doing. He could make people laugh, and that, again, that's the easiest way to diffuse sort of a potentially emotional situation like that of asking a deep question. It's like, oh, here, let me throw you a curveball, and then you'll forget that you were asking about it.
Exactly. When you were talking about the things that you went through as a journalist, I thought back to a movie that came out called The Hornet's Nest, about No Slack and a couple other units that were in Afghanistan at the time, 2010-11 period. And it was written, the movie was based off of Carlos and Mike Betcher's time there together as war correspondents, father and son, out together. And in the show, you can see them both train, the dad especially. You've seen him train, now he's out there with his son, who wanted to see what dad did for a living and try to learn it. And now he's worried when they get separated. You can see him just like he crumbles. And that became his last time over, and his son carried the torch from there.
Yeah. As I said, that's, sort of relates back to that conversation about being able to relate to other people. And how you end up kind of isolated. In fact, I don't know if you remember there was the program Proper Exit. It was a charity that ran a program for people who basically were evacuated out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and they would fly them back in and give them kind of a ceremony and allow them to sort of leave the country as the unit would have left under other circumstances. So there's one time in Kabul I was covering one of those. So there were 4 individuals. I'm trying to remember. I think it was a couple. I forget whether it was 2 or 3 Army and at least 1 Marine. But so they had all had injuries that they had to get evacuated out of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so they came back and they were talking to some troops in Kabul. And I just, remember one of them saying, he's like, I thought when I got home that the best way to handle things was to try to get as much distance from it as possible. and to not think about it, not talk to people, not stay in touch with people from his unit, all that. And he talked about how that was just the worst thing he could have possibly done, is to isolate himself and not at least stay in touch with people from his unit and all that. And again, he, fortunately figured it out and, was able to stick around. But that was, again, a big part of his message, was that notion of, stay connected, stay engaged, at least with that core group of people. And I think, again, in my experience, that was what was difficult, because when I get back, there were a few people in DC who I had known in Kabul. And so I had a little bit of a group. I use the term tribe a lot in the book. So, I had a few members of the tribe that were in DC that kind of helped me initially not feel, completely out of it and isolated. And so people that, I could talk to. And the thing that's interesting in reflecting on that is I realized, like, we actually never really talked about any of the serious stuff. We didn't talk about, like, that night and how did you feel and what did you think? And it was just knowing that, okay, we'd been in it together. So these are safe people to be around, and I can be myself. And if I do have a moment of a mild freak out or something like that, these people aren't going to judge me. I don't have to explain it. We all understand. But we still never really did deeply discuss, like, hey, how did you feel after that day when our friend got killed? I look back and I think, it is sort of an interesting thing that we did. We would drink together and joke and all that, and just sort of try to keep things light. But there were only one or two people that I ever really had those deep, holy crap discussions with. And again, I think that's just something that is necessary and important, to be able to feel that there is someone that you can talk to in those moments and just say, hey, remember that time when this thing happened? I'm thinking about that.
Right. We had when I was in 2010-11 in Kandahar, I get there and I came from Korea and met my unit there. I was Campbell to Korea, Campbell to Afghanistan, Kandahar. So KKK. I get in the tent and there's a young staff sergeant limping. I was like, damn, Sergeant, what's wrong with you? Heard you hurt? Can't even walk straight? And he walked by and another young soldier said, hey, Sergeant, he only has one leg. I said, what? I said, he's still here. I said, no, he came back. In 2007, he lost his leg in the same region, stayed in the military. He was a staff sergeant at the time, Staff Sergeant Greg Robinson. And he came back to the very same area where he lost his leg to serve again. And he stayed, he just retired now as a master sergeant. So he stayed in for a long time to stay with his, like you said, the tribe and stay with that knowing stuff. And now he's going to be a deputy in Illinois. So it's weird. Everything you're saying is clicking.
Yeah. Again, and that's why, to me, it was kind of important to write about this because, I think sometimes, there is a civil military divide, and, a lot of people in this country just don't understand and can't relate, can't possibly understand what service members have gone through and experienced. But there are a lot of civilians who do have, quite a bit of shared experience. And, it's not the same. I mean, we weren't, pulling triggers and dealing with, a lot of those aspects, but we're still in the same space, confronting a lot of the same questions about, what's going on here? Is this making a difference? Is this the right use of American, human beings and taxpayer money in these missions? And so I think it is important to kind of bridge those communities. And again, why I'm hoping to do, more speaking with veterans communities, say, hey, we do understand each other, and we can, build kind of a bigger tent and see how that, we can reinforce each other's needs and support and things like that. So, that was, again, to me, one of the important things about telling this story is that, civilians do go through a lot. And, with journalists, the other thing I realize is the incentives are much more against journalists trying to get help. Because if you think about it, it's an incredibly competitive business. So if you're a foreign correspondent, you're in, one of not a lot of slots doing that work. And so you want to stay in that field doing that work. So if you're in Ukraine right now reporting on the conflict, and you're starting to struggle, are you going to tap out and say, hey, I need a mental health break, send someone else in for a couple of weeks? Or are you going to go, no, I'm not going to do that because the big break in the story could happen in those 2 weeks, and I don't want my replacement to get the story. And oh, by the way, I don't want my bosses and my editors to say, oh, this person's having a hard time. We have to take him out of the field completely and, put him through a process before we let him go back. So, you sort of realize it's like, yeah, when you're in it, you're going to do everything you can to stay in it. And you don't want to start confronting this stuff until you're out. So that's one of the things I'm looking at is, how do I get friends and colleagues who are still in this to do more about their mental health, while they're going along? And how do you create a situation where there isn't a stigma and that news organizations don't punish people for saying they need a mental health break, or say, well, now I'm worried about this person, I don't want to send them back in. It's a tough dynamic to look at. And how do you get people to really, prioritize themselves sometimes when those, competitive career juices are flowing and you're feeling like, again, like I've got to be here for this story. I mean, I saw it in Libya in particular during the civil war in 2011. I saw a number of journalists who were grinding themselves into the ground. I mean, they were just fried, but they didn't want to leave because what happens if Gaddafi gets captured while I'm on break in Cyprus? And so that's a real part of it. And I think that's one of the things that is a tough dynamic in the news business, where you do have that competition and that sense that I want to get the story. I want to be the one who's there when the big thing happens. And so your inclination is to push yourself beyond what's reasonable.
Definitely. And that's, I think, in almost every profession, you don't want to take that knee and then be the one that's not there when something happens. You can go from sports to military to journalism or anywhere, and you don't want to be that guy or gal who said, I'm raising my hand, I'm gonna take a break, and then miss out on this big deal. Where that big deal could just be you taking that break and be coming back fresh, especially about the time of the Libyan conflict. I'm sure a lot of those over there were jumping between the three sectors at that point. You had Afghanistan, Iraq, you had the Arab Spring going on all throughout the Middle East there. So they're probably hitting everything, and then they wound up at Libya right for the height of it. And their minds are probably just not in the game.
Yeah. There were, unfortunately, some journalists who pushed it in Libya and unfortunately didn't come back. There were some who pushed it and got lucky. That is the nature of the business. That was sort of a weird realization for me, actually, is when I really got into it, I found that I was on the, I guess you could say, the risk averse end of the spectrum. You realize your threshold for danger, and like, okay, am I going to get in this car with this strange person and go off down this road that everyone is saying is really dangerous, in hope that I get to the other end and get the story? Or am I going to say that seems a little extreme for what's not a guaranteed story?
Right.
And there's definitely, like everything, there's a spectrum in journalism. There are people who, to me, were just absolute, cowboy types who would just go after everything and did want the most dangerous, the the most, outrageous things, and did want the camera on them with bullets flying and things blowing up behind them. And so there's, that's one of the things I'm very candid about in the book, right? There's a lot of ego. So there's no question. Let's not pretend that there aren't, journalists out there who are focusing, more on themselves than the story and the people they're covering. But that's, by no means all of them, or the majority for that matter. And most of us were kind of in the middle, where we're willing to take a certain amount of risk because we believe we're in telling important stories that if we're not there, several things can happen. I mean, obviously, people aren't aware, so they're not pushing on government to make the right decisions, or pushing on leaders to change course. But one of the things I write about, you mentioned the Arab Spring. So I was actually in Bahrain for about a week during the Arab Spring. And, Egypt and Libya were the really big Arab Spring stories. Bahrain was a little bit under the radar, but I was there when things went really sideways and the government cracked down on protesters, and there were clashes. And there was a lot of crazy stuff going on that I wasn't expecting when I got there. But I spent one day at a hospital there where people were coming in covered in, bird shot and strange wounds. And they were all saying that they were out in their village, and masked forces came in and started shooting at them and firing tear gas and all this stuff. And just really chaotic and pretty hairy stuff that was going on. And so, I was there, I was witnessing it, I was reporting it. And a couple months later, I was back in DC, and I got invited to a dinner that was hosted by a public relations firm that was doing lobbying on behalf of the government of Bahrain.
Wow.
So they had brought in, I think it's like 5 members of Bahrain's parliament. And so it was them and 2 other journalists and myself. And so we're in this nice club in DC, and these people are talking about it. And one of the members of parliament was talking about how crazy it was in Bahrain. He said, you can't understand what it was like. There were protesters running around with guns. These people were armed and supported by Iran. They were, all this stuff. I mean, just spinning this tale about these armed protesters and how they had taken over hospitals and were using them as operations centers where they were stashing weapons and planning protests and assaults against the government from these hospitals. And so I'm sitting listening to this guy. And at the end of the dinner, I go up to him and I said, it was interesting listening to you describing what was going on. Because I said, when I was in Bahrain, when all of this was happening, I didn't see any protesters with guns. I didn't see any hospitals that were turned into militarized operations centers. In fact, I saw the opposite. And the guy just froze. I mean, he had no idea that there was someone in the room who had been there and was a witness to what was going on and saw the government and mysterious pro-government forces cracking down on largely unarmed demonstrators. Certainly, I never saw guns in the hands of demonstrators. I mean, they certainly threw rocks and things like that. But so I called this guy out, and again, he just kind of froze and backpedaled, and it just made me realize that they had spent several days going around Washington, telling members of Congress, telling the State Department, telling people in the administration that these Iranian-backed thugs were out on the street with guns and trying to take down the government, which is completely untrue. And fortunately, I and some others were there to witness it and to be able to provide a factual record for it. But you think about how many things go on around the world that aren't witnessed, where people with interests can then say, this is what happened. This is what's going on. You look at Russia and their ability to control information and make up narratives when people aren't there to witness, or they're just used to hearing government propaganda and accepting it as fact. So that it was, to me, again, an important thing about why journalists are necessary in these places, because you do need, as you say, you need people there calling balls and strikes. And
strikes.
and so back to sort of the point is that so you're willing to take a certain amount of risks to try to do truth telling, hold people accountable, and make sure that folks aren't coming through Washington on public relations tours making things up and there's no one there to call them out on it.
Exactly. And then we wind up giving a suitcase full of money for no reason to them to help them rebuild things that they destroyed themselves.
Yeah, any number of things like that.
Yes. So, Sean, we talked a lot of things. I want to put you on the spot here. You get to sit at an orientation of new journalists, aspiring journalists, and you get to tell them 3 tips of how to be a great journalist and what they're getting into if they want the international side of it.
All right, 3, huh? Okay. So, all right. I mean, number 1 is something that I do say to people is learn how to write. I mean, it is the most important skill in journalism, and I've had to at times coach or mentor or edit people who hadn't learned writing well, and you lose a lot of time and effort with that when people should be able to focus on the substance. So basic rule number 1: get your writing skills down, nail them, and not have that be an issue. I think, number 2 is kind of a check yourself kind of thing. Like, ask yourself, like, why are you in this? What do you want to accomplish? What do you think the mission is? Because yes, it is exciting. And certainly, especially foreign reporting in, non-conflict zones, is a fantastic job. I mean, getting to run around different places and see things, it's an incredible experience. And even within it, like I had one of the most amazing moments of my life in the Congo, riding on top of a tank with Indian peacekeepers riding off into the jungle in the night with a glowing volcano in the distance.
Wow.
And it was just one of the most epic moments of just, this is so remote. It's so, no one else in the world has, had that experience at that moment, kind of thing. So, it is incredibly seductive, but if you're going into it as a public servant. You're doing it to inform people. You're doing it to ultimately help people on the ground. When you're walking through a village in Pakistan that's smoldering because it was attacked in a case of religious violence, you have an obligation to those people to tell their story, to capture their pain in a responsible way, to not, traumatize them by trying to, hype the story or anything like that. But you have a responsibility to these people to take in their pain, communicate it to the world, and make people aware of what's happened so that hopefully someone takes action so it doesn't happen again. That's the obligation of the craft. So if you're not, in it for those ultimately, altruistic reasons, that you're there to provide witness, to be there to hold people accountable, and that, yes, you can have fun and adventure and make the most of it, but you're a public servant first, so make sure you're in it for the right reason. And number 3, I would say, if you are thinking about especially the conflict route, understand again what you're getting into, and that even the best person at compartmentalizing can't keep it all out. And you've got to be prepared for the fact that you are going to see the absolute worst of what human beings do to each other, and it's going to be hard to process. And it will, for me, it changed my view of the world and people. And I'm still trying to be less cynical and pessimistic. But it's pretty hard when you see, some of the awful things that people will do to other people. So, again, be prepared for that, and think about how are you gonna process that? How are you gonna live with that going forward? And let's hope that your news organization or whoever you're working for is going to take some responsibility for that and provide some resources and make sure you're okay along the way.
Outstanding. Great tips right there. And we started the conversation talking about passport stamps, searching the world for a war to call home by Sean Carberry, which came out just less than a month ago, August 15th. Tell the audience where they can get that book and maybe read up on it and send you questions.
Yeah, so it's the usual online places. So it's Amazon, Barnes and Noble. My website for the book is passport-stamps.com. And so on that, there are links to a few different places you can buy it. It's not really in many stores. I do know there's a stack of autographed copies at the Twig in San Antonio, Texas, because I was there a couple weeks ago and did a book event. So signed some books. There's some there. There's some in the bookstore near me in DC. But available online. Regular hard book or paperback, but ebook as well. And eventually I'm going to lock myself in a closet and record the audio book. So that's coming eventually. It's just been hard to carve out the time to sit and do that. But and I also have a Substack website where I try to do weekly essays about what's going on in foreign policy, foreign affairs, and tie together some of my reporting experience. And so weave in some of my stories and places and talk about that. And that's passportstamps.net is the Substack. And I also have a lot of stuff. So when I wrote the book, the first draft was about 2.5 times the length of a book. So I had a lot of stuff that I had to cut out and go through a process of deciding, okay, I think this is a really cool little story, but is the reader really going to suffer if that's not in the final version? So lots of material that I've been gradually trickling out on the Substack site, so that some of the things that didn't make the final version are still there. So I'm able to at least use all the material that I sat down and wrote.
Outstanding, Sean. This has been a great conversation. We're running low on time right now, Russia, but we are running low on our stream time. This has been awesome. Listeners, the website is going across the bottom right now, and it will be in the show notes when it gets published. And when the audio comes out, it'll be about the end of November. This is going to be live on YouTube from now on. Again, Sean, thank you very much for coming on and agreeing to hang out with us for this hour here with us here in Tennessee and you up there in the nation's capital. This has been awesome.
Thanks, Rich, and keep doing what you're doing. It's really important.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.
This message is from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Did you serve in the military? If so, you can obtain a free lifetime pass to more than 2,000 federal recreation sites. These sites are located across more than 400 million acres of public lands, including national parks, wildlife refuges, and forests. The lands host activities to fit any lifestyle: hiking, biking, fishing, camping, and much more. Gold Star families are also eligible for these free lifetime passes. Plus, they cover entrance fees for a driver and all passengers in a car, or up to 3 additional adults at sites that charge per person. Obtaining one is easy. Just go to the National Park Service website, nps.gov, or the National Park Service app.
Thanks for checking us out and being a part of the MisFitNation. Don't forget to visit our website at themisfitnation.com. That's themisfitnation.com. Check out all of our past episodes and get some of that great Misfit Nation gear. As always, be humble, stay hungry, and keep hustling Because we are.
MisFitNation.